Kia ora and good afternoon from Auckland. I'm Murray Bruges. I'm the director of the Helen Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar exploring New Zealand's nuclear-free policy and marking 40 years this month since the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland. Before we begin, as many of you will have heard, our foundation is delighted to be launching an Honorary Fellows program this month, featuring highly respected and experienced policy thinkers. Public policy expert Dr. Jonathan Boston, foreign and trade policy expert Stephen Jacoby, and development and global health expert Lucy Castles will be writing opinion pieces and convening webinar discussions for our foundation over the coming months. And next Thursday at 12 p.m. we'll launch that program with a webinar with all three fellows reflecting on the challenges and opportunities facing New Zealand in the 2020s, moderated by Helen. We also have a range of other exciting webinars in the works, including on junk food and obesity, on social cohesion, and on climate policy. Some of those webinars will be only available to members of the foundation. So if you'd like to hear more conversations like today's and to support our foundation's mission to develop long-term solutions to New Zealand's long-term most pressing challenges, we'd love to have you as a member. Membership fees are currently only $65 a year and only $35 if you're a student and retired. So it's a great time to join. Joining takes 2 minutes via our website or via the link that my colleague Victoria will shortly post in the chat of today's webinar. So to today's webinar. First up, our regular reminder that this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call. So your cameras and microphones are deactivated and you're safe to eat your lunch and drink your coffee without being seen or heard. But we do hope you'll participate in the webinar by submitting your questions for our panel into the Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can do this whenever a question occurs to you throughout the webinar, and Helen will put those questions to our panelists at around about 12:40. You'll also see there's a separate chat function where you can find various links, but please put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A. And finally, please let us know what you thought of this webinar by filling out a feedback form that should appear in your browser. It only takes 2 minutes and it really helps us design webinars that you want to see. So it's the 40-year anniversary this month of the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, and that marks a timely moment to consider the advent of New Zealand's nuclear-free policy and what it means in the very different geopolitical landscape of the 2020s. The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior and the development of New Zealand's nuclear policy more generally remains a transformational moment for this country. The early mid-1980s saw global politics manifesting first in our region and then in our largest city in a way few New Zealanders could have imagined. Alongside the Gallipoli campaign, it ranks as among the most significant periods of the 20th century in determining not only our country's staunchly independent foreign policy, but also in shaping our national self-conception. And the effects are still with us today, with the events of the 1980s shaping not just our relationships with our traditional friends and allies in the West, but also with our closest neighbors in the Pacific, deepening our partnerships with many small island states in our region. And it also gave New Zealand the standing and the motivation to pursue a strong nuclear non-proliferation agenda on the global stage, a goal that still guides New Zealand foreign policy decades later. So to reflect on the events of the 80s and what they mean for New Zealand in the 2020s, we're lucky to have a panel of experts and activists, several of whom were deeply involved in the movements that led to New Zealand's nuclear-free policy being adopted and maintained these past 40 years. Dr. Kate Dews has been an anti-nuclear campaigner and peace educator for over 50 years. She has been involved in a wide range of peace and activism campaigns, including as part-time lecturer in peace studies at the University of Canterbury for 20 years, the New Zealand government expert on the UN study on disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation education, and as a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on disarmament matters. Dr. Kennedy Graham is a former New Zealand diplomat, a UN official, academic, and MP with a career spanning international law, climate policy, and global governance. He was a key contributor to negotiations for the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone. And from 2013 to 2024, he was founding director of the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies. Kevin Hackwell has a storied history in conservation and peace activism. Beginning at 15, he has worked at the confluence of civil society, environmental science, and political policymaking. He was involved in a range of peace group activities leading up to the passing of the nuclear-free legislation. And he was chair and vice chair of Greenpeace New Zealand through most of the 1990s. And in August 1983, he was arrested and charged with interfering with a ship for swimming out to the USS Texas, the last nuclear powered and armed warship to visit New Zealand. And Dr. Russell Norman is one of New Zealand's leading voices on sustainability. He has been the Executive Director of Greenpeace Aotearoa New Zealand since November 2015. Before that, he was an MP and co-leader of the New Zealand Green Party. So a very warm welcome to our esteemed panelists, and over to you, Helen.
Well, thank you, Murray, and good afternoon, everyone, and great to be on with the panel, all of whom are well known to me from many years of anti-nuclear, nuclear-free and environmental advocacy, shall we say. So 10th of July was actually the day when Rainbow Warrior was bombed in the port of Auckland, a terrorist attack, sadly killing one crew member. And the 40th anniversary has been marked in various ways, including last night on board the Rainbow Warrior, tied up at the Viaduct Basin, shortly to begin its big voyage up to Brazil and Belém on the northeast coast, where the climate change annual conference will be. And this tells us a bit, I guess, about the confluence between the nuclear-free campaigning legacy of the Rainbow Warrior, the name, and of course environmental advocacy as well. So just to get us going, I'm going to ask each of our panelists for a brief moment of reflection. Where were you when Rainbow Warrior was bombed? What do you remember about that moment? And what impact did it have on you? Kate.
Thanks, Helen. I was in our kitchen with 3 small daughters. The radio was on and the 6-year-old said, "Mum, why are you crying?" And I had to answer to her that I knew people on the boat, and intuitively I knew that the French had done it. So that was a huge moment for me down in Christchurch, and it certainly has impacted on my ongoing work, given me the strength to stand up to certain ambassadors from France and other countries who we know performed state terrorism, and their policies were ones that needed to be challenged for the rest of my life.
Fantastic. Ken, where in the world were you?
Well, probably asleep at the time, but I was in Wellington, and I remember going back into the office, MFAT, early the next morning, and of course it was discussed in depth, but everything was conjecture, so there was no clear policy implication at that moment, early in the morning. I would just add that along with Rainbow Warrior, which was July, the other comparable experience that impacted me hugely was in the same year, was 4 or 5 months earlier with the Buchanan. And at that stage, I was on the working group, and we were having for the Rarotonga Treaty, and we had our second meeting in Canberra. And on the Friday, Chris Beebe, who was the leader of the delegation, took a phone call from Wellington and was obviously hugely concerned. And it transpired about the Buchanan, and so we were all concerned, and we flew back to Wellington over the weekend. And on the Monday, Helen will know this much more intimately than I do, out it came on the Monday. And so those 2 experiences hugely impacted me and prompted me to take a scholarship the next year and write up that stuff, and then get sent to Geneva, the mission in 1987 to promote it. So it had a huge impact on my trajectory.
Fantastic. Kevin, where were you? Still in the harbour with placards? Or?
No, that was been earlier. No, I was like Katie. It was waking up and listening to Morning Report and hearing it was the news and being just shocked by what was going on. And I remember, like Katie, also thinking, "Oh, that's the French," and heading down that afternoon to Peacefield Aotearoa, which at that point was in a little office above the bowling alley in Pyrie Street in Wellington, and talking to Owen Wilkes and Nicky Hager about it, and none of us could. Although we suspected the French, we were thinking they can't be that stupid. Surely not. It was just that incredulity that it had happened and that someone had done it. But like Kennedy, it came. I agree. It was very much about we'd already gone nuclear free. It was that sense of New Zealand was being put upon by the big powers. And of course, the thing I remember very much about it was that the silence, the deafening silence from Australia and Britain and America, all our allies were very, did nothing. Basically, I think, like a lot of New Zealanders, just reinforced our need to do our own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Russell, for you?
So I was in Brisbane. So it was a decade before I came to Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, but when I was growing up in Brisbane, so it was my first year of university, 85, and there were huge. We used to go to these massive Palm Sunday peace rallies every year. It was the biggest rallies that happened pretty much every year. Even in Brisbane, Joe Bjelke-Petersen couldn't stop them. And so, yeah, I mean, there was a really strong sense that this was connected to the struggle to end nuclear weapons, which was really one of the things that hung over us. And I remember hanging over us as kids as we were growing up, is the threat of nuclear annihilation, and this was part of that. So yeah, definitely had presence in Australia.
Well, I remember it because I was in Zimbabwe, as you are, on the way to the 3rd UN World Conference for Women. And when you hear news like that, you immediately think, as others have said, what's the motive? Who would have a motive to blow up the Rainbow Warrior? Before this went public. But Kevin, as you said, I remember the deafening silence from, quote, traditional friends. UK, these were strange. Australia was very unhappy with New Zealand's nuclear-free stand, I think because they thought it would put more pressure on their government from their public if New Zealand could do this. United States, well, the rest is history. The United Kingdom actually sent out a minister to try and tell us the error of our ways. That didn't get very far. And astonishingly, the Russians seemed to think we were having such a sea change in foreign policy that they sent out a deputy minister who seemed to think we were on the verge of joining the Warsaw Pact. He had to be disabused of such notions as well, as I recall. So it was kind of crazy, crazy times. But Kate, you'll remember the US reaction and how that developed and how this ended up shaping our foreign policy for decades to come.
Totally. I mean, I remember Longy very well meeting Schultz, and the answer from Schultz basically is that we end the alliance, but we end up as friends. Well, yeah, who needs those friends? But anyway, at that time, massive reaction from all the allies. And as Kevin said, how were the Australians involved, not just with what was happening with Rainbow Warrior, but response to our anti-nuclear policy was horrific. You asked earlier, what did it mean that could happen? Well, we built on a lot of the past where people had been calling for a South Pacific nuclear-free zone. We'd got that signed in 1985. We'd taken France to the World Court in 1973. We built on a lot of initiatives that had been taken, but one of the main things that you were able to do, I think, Helen, was you appointed us also, you made sure in the law that we had a public advisory committee on disarmament and arms control, and I was lucky to be on that first committee in particular, where we were able to really monitor what New Zealand was doing in voting at the UN. Frequently we were voting with our so-called traditional allies, supporting nuclear deterrence, voting against any resolution that was calling for negative security assurances or even a convention on nuclear weapons. That committee in particular was able to advise the Prime Minister and government on the implementation of the Act. But what you put in place after the break with ANZUS was that you were able to change the whole way we did our defence. And I've frequently taught my students about what you put into the 2000 defence framework, where you called for diplomacy and mediation and pursuit of disarmament and arms control as a form of security, of course, looking at global environmental concerns and providing development assistance and building all the trade and cultural links, which built good relationships with people, and the restructuring of the Defence Forces, what you did with the aircraft in particular, and phasing out the Skyhawk was incredibly good, and promoting a nuclear-free South Pacific. So, Kevin and I were very involved in anti-frigate debate in 89, 90, around that time, when 70% of the population didn't want the Australian frigates. And Longy admitted at the time that we were being pushed into buying them because of our relationship with Australia. But what it's meant is that we've been able to find our voice and speak our truth and try and develop an independent foreign policy. Although I don't think we've got one now, but certainly at the time, what we were doing was carving that out and taking a lead on disarmament in the UN in particular, which we're incredibly proud of. And we even got a conservative New Zealand government to argue illegality of nuclear weapons at the World Court in 1995, which I was surprised about. We reopened the 1973 ICJ case against French testing in September 95. And we've continued to take initiatives and leadership in disarmament throughout the UN, especially on the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So it opened up a great way in which we could promote what we really believe in, being a Pacifica country and not necessarily supporting our so-called like-minded allies. That'll do.
And over time, this position became bipartisan. Obviously, the 1987 election, the National Party was still, banging on about it, but a decisive defeat then led them to adopt the policy of being nuclear free. There was a little bit of a fracas in the early 90s, people may recall, when Jim Bolger had some kind of commission which recommended that, nuclear power wouldn't be a problem, so you could have nuclear powered subs or whatever. And that just didn't really fly. It got Jim a visit to the White House, but in the end, not implementable, because people said, well, these nuclear powered vessels are probably the most likely to be nuclear armed as well. So in the end, that all settled down. Everyone came on board. And I remember with the case going to the International Court at The Hague, Jim Bolger actually called me in as leader of the opposition, and whichever other small parties there were at the time. He wanted everyone in behind it. And, that was measure of the times. Perhaps we don't see as much of that now. But Ken, you looked at this from the perspective first as a diplomat, and then obviously a very well-informed observer. Do you think New Zealand was punching above its weight on disarmament in those days? Can we keep doing this? Are we struggling a bit at the moment on it?
Well, back then, I think we were. I prefer to, rather than say punching above the weight, because that implies kind of national power, which we don't have a lot of in military terms. But I distinguish between national power on the one hand and sovereign equality on the other. Because because sovereign equality, 193 states who have an equal voice, and that's what we articulated clearly on the basis of sovereign equality, and that's what got us heard. And in that respect, I'd say two things: that we basically had a dual policy. On the one hand, it was the ship ban, obviously the ship bans, which was political, then became legal in 87. And that got global public attention, but it was political. But at least my experience is the distinction between that and what was going on in Geneva, especially in Geneva, New York, where when the Prime Minister, David Longy, went, and he gave two speeches in March 85, you will recall, obviously the Oxford Union debate. But he did that in a personal capacity. Only 4 days later, he went to Geneva and he gave a very similar speech, which was an extraordinarily important speech, because he was speaking officially on behalf of New Zealand to the CD, the Conference on Disarmament. And that was the rejection of nuclear deterrence, which he and you articulated in Parliament at Oxford but especially in Geneva. And that was 85. So when I end up in Geneva in 87, and one of the most satisfying moments of my time in foreign affairs was being able to write a letter. Kate talks about the PACDAC and so on. Write a letter to all the ambassadors to the missions to the UN in Geneva, saying that New Zealand was now setting up funds, financial support funding for disarmament groups in New Zealand and PACDAC, all based on French reparations from the Rainbow Warrior. And that letter went out to everybody, including the French ambassador, and it was superb.
Yes, a high point in a diplomatic career. Kevin and Russell, obviously the Rainbow Warrior bombing took place when we were campaigning against French nuclear testing and against nuclear weapons in general. We came out against deterrence. We were for a nuclear weapons-free South Pacific, but we were also very conscious that in the South Pacific, the nuclear weapons testing was one of many environmental threats. And I wondered whether you'd like to talk for a moment, both of you, about how the conservation and nuclear-free movements have perhaps leveraged off each other and been together part of forging, a cleaner, greener, peaceful identity, as it were. Kevin?
Yeah, sure. The conservation movement and the peace movement definitely intertwined, but I'd say actually all the movements. I mean, at the time there was the Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, the anti-apartheid, Springbok Tour. There was a whole pile of stuff going on in New Zealand. It was a point of a lot of social change going on, a generational change, a shift, and the movements reinforced and supported each other in all sorts of ways. And I can, when I think of the activism that people had learnt how to do things under the anti-Vietnam War, the women's movement, the forest movement, against the logging of the West Coast forests, the beach schemes, etc. There was a lot going on, and then of course the Springbok Tour of the 81. It meant that people were picking up on these issues, and they realised that it was about having to change the way we saw ourselves as a nation and what we wanted to have from our politics and from our government. And I think that's one of the things. Whenever a warship came, for example, it became a focus. But when the warship wasn't there, there was heaps of stuff going on all over the place. And the fact that the peace movement, for example, there were 400 peace groups in New Zealand, and Greenpeace or CND, I think CND had 4 or 5 branches. They were the biggest, group of organisations. There were kindergarten peace groups. There were church peace groups. The fact is, we had this very broad, incredibly broad and diverse movement that was very, very much grassroots. And I think that grassroots stuff is what pushed things together. And as I say, the movements reinforced each other. I think that was the key thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I became a young MP for Mount Albert in 1981, the Mount Albert Peace Group was very dynamic. And it was on the back, really, of those groups up and down New Zealand who probably all of us toured at some point speaking to. That was the backbone of, what became, a New Zealand-wide position. Russell, Greenpeace to this day is linking the campaigns, right? Peace, nuclear-free, conservation, environment, oceans. How do you see the movements leveraging off each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are really linked. And I think it's a really good point, and which we should never forget, which is that it does really require civil society mobilization to underpin any kind of change, progressive change. And so sometimes I think people focus on what happens at the level of political parties or the state and state apparatus, but and that's all really important, and that's history. But without that civil society mobilization, there's kind of no driving force really to push it through. So and if we're going to deal with something like climate change, which is like one of the contemporary existential issues that we're facing, as well as a renewed threat from nuclear weapons, it is going to require civil society pressure. But yeah, I mean, the other thing I was reflecting on as we were doing all this work, and I was talking about last night when we were on the Rainbow Warrior, was the connection with the anti-colonial struggle, which I don't think I'd fully appreciated until the last little while, just how deep it was. I was looking at a picture of Walter Lennie at Takaparawhau, Bastion Point in 1977, who then went on to become the first Prime Minister of Vanuatu, which has been a tremendously positive force in terms of climate change and deep sea mining and so forth. So those kind of deep connections between the anti-colonial struggle and the anti-nuclear struggle were also something that I kind of only really only appreciated recently, how deep that connection was and how important it was.
Absolutely. And, you remind us of Vanuatu, which was one of the later Pacific states to win its independence. And remember, they had the very complicated arrangement of the condominium, where both France and the United Kingdom had a foothold there. And it wasn't easy to get independence for the whole of Vanuatu. And Walter Lennie was just such a principled and strong voice, and very strong on the nuclear free issue in the Pacific too. Last night we had a wonderful man from French Polynesia and one of the atolls affected by the Mururoa testing, speaking very eloquently. And of course, to this day, French Polynesia is a colony. Let's not forget this. But I absolutely agree. The role of civil society is so critical. Having been a decision maker, when you take a step out front, you like to know that there's people there who are going to say yes, yes, because plenty is going to say she's crazy or that's wrong. So you have to have civil society, backing progressive causes to take them forward. So maybe looking a bit to the future now, and talking a little about the nuclear landscape today. And I made a couple of comments on this at Russell and Greenpeace's event on the Rainbow Warrior last night. But I mean, nuclear weapons control in architecture is in some disarray. We have the intermediate range treaty, which very much applied to Europe, which both the US and Russia, I understand, have now abandoned. There's quite a major treaty, the New START one, between the US and Russia, which expires next year. That's not long to get a rollover in today's fraught geopolitics. We've got the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which doesn't achieve a lot and certainly has never seen the 5 acknowledged nuclear powers move towards complete general disarmament. We have other nuclear powers which have arisen, which don't subject themselves to the discipline, whether it's of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whether it's the North Koreans, India, Pakistan, Israel, and then Iran, which does, off and on and to some degree, ends up having its nuclear sites bombed, which is highly risky. So, and we're in an era of AI, ask AI, please create me a dirty nuclear bomb from a small amount of fissile material, it'll probably tell you. And these are scary times and there's new threats. So, Ken, you mentioned that, there's new things the governments could be doing. Where in this sort of rich field of pickings would you be recommending that the New Zealand government focus its attention?
Yeah, right. Well, I can come up with 3 ideas in that respect for the 2020s. You have to place it as, for the obvious, state the obvious, you have to place it in the context of current geopolitical strategic tension. And so the political probability theory of it getting through immediately may be low, which in my view does not mean, in fact, you can do a flip argument and say, therefore you have to produce these ideas in times of tension, and then there's the moment of opportunity and political leadership somewhere. So I would suggest 3, and I would preface it by saying that the issue of keeping our nuclear free policy alive requires, and you more or less mentioned this, requires policy, the rigor of policy retention, because it's quite easy to do a lot of murmuring and modify the policy and substance while you are articulating a theoretical retention. And I think we've got to be careful about that. But my first suggestion is that I think the critical thing is the rejection of nuclear deterrence as a theory for your national defense, national security. And you and Sir Jeff Palmer and David Lange articulated that quite brilliantly in the 1980s. But I was always conscious that it was not an integral part of the 1987 legislation, which is focusing on non-deployment, non-possession, etc. And so it is simply a political policy, not legally embedded in New Zealand. So one could consider, and this is where you don't have to dialogue with the rest of the world, it's an internal dialogue. You could think about amending the 87 legislation to include a section in which we renounce nuclear deterrence for our defense. And that becomes a legislative, almost a part of constitution, certainly statutory law. That's one. Secondly, I think we need to, and this has been articulated already in this discussion, the need to determine whether AUKUS and New Zealand's potential involvement in certainly Pillar 2, but also, for that matter, Australia's involvement in Pillar 1, is a violation of, quote, the spirit of the Treaty of Rarotonga. Now, the Rarotonga is fairly unique in the sense that Chris Beebe was really insistent on getting the idea of violating the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty. And I devoted some time to checking out what that might mean. There's only one book done by a former ICJ judge on the spirit of a treaty as opposed to the letter. And we don't have time to go into great detail about AUKUS, or at least I won't, others can. But I personally would be concluding that both Australia's engagement in Pillar 1 violates the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty, and New Zealand's potential engagement in Pillar 2 does the same. But the irony here is that yet another aspect of the Rarotonga Treaty was that you can't withdraw from the treaty. You can only, other than the fact if somebody else has violated the treaty. And so if Australia can't withdraw from the Rarotonga Treaty, but its violation of the spirit through AUKUS could mean that other members of the Rarotonga Treaty could. So it's worth just exploring the legal and political implications of that. And then the third one, which is in some ways I think it's interrelated. I think it's the critical one. It's New Zealand, which played a major role in the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, being a vice chair, and obviously one of the, 72 parties, I think, 73. Article 12 requires states parties to actively encourage other countries to join the treaty. And I think New Zealand and Costa Rica and Austria and Ireland, and actually quite a number of countries, ASEAN countries too, could form a group where you pick up on encouraging states parties to join, and it's based on, actually, Helen, you're very much involved as a member with the elders, and you have your agenda for nuclear minimization with its 4 doctrines. That can be seen as part of it. And a very closely related bit, which would come as a surprise, the Rajiv Gandhi plan, which was a 10-year time frame for the elimination of nuclear weapons. He articulated it in UNSOD 3, which was the 3rd special session on disarmament back in 1988. And Kate and I were there for that. That Gandhi plan, can you believe that India, a nuclear power, as recently as I think it was 2014 or 15, reiterated support for that plan. So you have a nuclear power which is not against an elimination. So New Zealand and the same number of countries under Article 12 of the Prohibition Treaty could develop with the elders a 10-year time frame. And it was a very good time frame plan. It had 3 phases, and it was going to run from 2000 to 2010, and you would eliminate the nuclear weapons. Now, they've come from 64,000 down to 12,000, and the elders say it should go to 2,000. But you can have an elimination plan as part of all this, in which there's a group promoting it as a implication of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So those are three suggestions.
Well, very, very substantial suggestions too, Ken, and the last one would be interesting to talk about a bit more with respect to what the elders could do. You briefly touched on AUKUS, and Kevin, I know you're doing a lot of work on this at the moment. Prima facie, I agree with Ken that Australian involvement potentially is a violation of the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty. But if New Zealand were to sign up to another pillar of it, the same would apply, would it not?
Yes.
I would assume so, and I think it's really important that we say no to AUKUS in any pillar, in any form. AUKUS is clearly an offensive sort of posturing by the US, Australia, and Britain against China, and with America becoming increasingly more erratic. And it seems to have really, the threat of a future war with China, and from that posturing and from where the US is going, is very real. And of course, any war which involves the US and China very likely could become a nuclear war. It's unlikely it would ever stay just conventional, given what's at stake. And so, no, we should stay well clear of it. New Zealand is the safest country in the world. If you do a hemisphere based on Wellington as the North or South Pole and look at where the equator is, it doesn't include any of Asia, any of the North America, just touches the very bottom of South America, includes basically Australia, Antarctica, and the Indonesian archipelago. We are surrounded by the world's largest moat. We are militarily the safest country in the world, as you will know from the work you've done, Helen, etc. So that we should be talking about not being involved in any of these military alliances. We should have a genuinely independent foreign policy and military, defense policy. And it should be about defense. If we're going to have any sort of military at all, we should be looking at a porcupine New Zealand, which is purely about what it would take to defend our shores. Not to have any ability to project offensive power anywhere, and that was things like getting rid of our strike air force, etc. And so AUKUS is a real danger. Signing up to Pillar 2 and thinking somehow it's going to help our industry base by, we're going to get access to AI and other technologies. It's a nonsense. The costs to the economy of hitching yourself to military development and spending is enormous. We're much better off if we're going to invest in our economy doing it in other ways.
Kate, when you saw the debate over AUKUS begin and also see the series of defence related agreements which the current government is signing with the US, do you have an awful feeling of here we go again?
Absolutely. And I am really worried about what's happening with Talisman Sabre and why the hell we are there with 19 states who are supposedly like-minded. Most of them vote against the TPNW. They are not like-minded in terms of our policy, except probably Fiji and Tonga. And we're sending a huge number of troops there and spending a lot of money there. We've got the Te Kaha coming back from the Middle East at the moment. What the hell are we doing there? I agree with you, Helen, when you call for Five Eyes for us to actually withdraw from Five Eyes. Dream on. We used to raise that in PACDAC in 1988, calling it SIGINT. But you certainly have been concerned about mission creep within Five Eyes and what it's dragging us into. And I think if we're going to have a truly independent foreign policy, we need to be able to be criticising what the US and Israel, etc., are doing. They're not issues that we would agree with within a Pacifica state. And I think, Kevin, we've also got to be looking not just about our own defence, but looking in our Pacific Island responsibilities and disaster relief and UN peacekeeping. And that was something you also promoted, Helen, in the past. So yes, deja vu again. And what's happening with Rocket Lab and down here in Aotearoa, what they're doing out at Kaiteriti Spit,
Mm.
the possibility of testing drones out there that could be used for killer drones in the future. I think it's very scary, and we've got to keep monitoring and speaking up, but we need to be training our young people to be doing that as well. Because we're all getting old.
Yeah, I mean, Rocket Lab is now a US registered company. It's clearly integrating into the military industrial complex. I also noticed in the context of the advocacy for AUKUS 2, there's quite an industry group with a number of Christchurch components who really want to be on board to be part of, you know, this kind of military industrial spending. So it is a worry. You know, I'm all for sustainable economic growth, but sustainable growth is not, you know, destructive military investment. But Kate, you finished your comment by referring to younger generations. So I'm going to come to Russell because I think Russell got a history of close to half a century, and I remember meeting David McTaggart, who began it all those years ago when he came to New Zealand. But you, notwithstanding that you're at least half a century or so old, you still relate to young people. You still have ways of, you know, bringing young people along. How are you feeling about, you know, sensitizing new generations of Kiwis to the importance of the nuclear-free positioning that we've had all these years?
Yeah, I reckon we've got some work to do. I mean, there is, that's my dog in the background. There is a kind of a knowledge about the Rainbow Warrior, and all of that. And so there is some good background knowledge because of the way that the Rainbow Warrior is in the curriculum and stuff like that. So I think that's quite helpful. But we still have a lot more to do. It feels like there's yeah, I mean, you know, like, because we're Greenpeace, you know, we're not doing a huge amount on it ourselves, right? In terms of nuclear disarmament. And it I do feel like we need more of a renewed attention to it. It does feel to me. I mean, then because climate change has become the dominant issue, right, in terms of young people. Like you saw those huge mobilizations around climate change a few years ago. But what we don't have is the density of organisation on the ground, the kind of the way that Kevin was describing it before with all these local groups and stuff. There isn't that level of density about organisation about climate change or anything much really, because so much happens through social media, which is incredibly effective. Like we do have the ability to reach lots and lots of people. Which is great, but what we don't have is that kind of face-to-face connection. And so I do think that's another missing piece of the puzzle. But yeah, I mean, it feels to me like we should be, speaking as Greenpeace, should be having more of a focus on the peace and nuclear issues, because it just hasn't been something we spent a lot of time on over recent years.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a big agenda awaiting Greenpeace on this one, I think. Maybe I'll dip into our questions now. There's one from Tiffany Matsis, who says, my daughter's heading off next month to Hiroshima for a youth peace conference marking the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Japan. New Zealand has a very proud history of being anti-nuclear and pro-disarmament, but do you think we still have anything current to be proud of? Kate?
Absolutely we do. And I'm thrilled they're going to Hiroshima and Nagasaki because it's incredibly impactful for our youth to be there. And some of my daughters have been there, but also I think we've got other anniversaries coming up that some of us are planning for, not just the 80th of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this next month, but the 30th anniversary of the World Court Opinion is next year. And then we've got the 40th anniversary of nuclear-free legislation. We've still got it. That's good news.
Yeah.
We're going to keep it. We've got, our young people are proud of it. But it's how do we support our young people now to continue to advocate and monitor and keep governments accountable, unless we are teaching in our universities, giving courses to our schools, providing resource material and funding. And I noticed someone had put a question up before saying it was great that we've got the Peace and Disarmament Education Trust funding, but we haven't. They say about the Disarmament Education UN Implementation Fund. Well, bad news, and I'm not happy about this, is that has just been canned by this particular government, saying we'll save 100,000 this year and 100,000 next year. We've got former Prime Ministers like Helen Clark and others who've supported us writing to the government saying, for heaven's sake, if you want to have good dialogue and young people and NGO input into decision making about disarmament issues, then you actually have to fund it. And we could have one day's military spending dedicated, that's an old dream, isn't it, Kevin? Back to mediation and teaching our kids peace education and supporting our young people going to Hiroshima, going to the UN, being on government delegations, learning about disarmament and funding it, which is not happening at the moment.
Yes, unfortunate to see what's, tiny amounts of money in the overall scheme of things going down the drain at the current time. I see Josh Mortensen put in a question very early. Do you think it's time for an apology for the French government? Well, I mean, I think at the time that the UN brokered the deal with New Zealand, where the French paid reparations, if you like, there was an apology as part of the deal.
Yeah.
But no doubt more and more fulsome comments could be made. Anne French has also raised the issue of engaging younger people, says it can't just be us boomers. This is true. But I think, as Russell said, while there's work to do, there is hope that, young people are very, very switched on. And Trevor Johnson's also raised the level of awareness among Gen Z. I mean, you're right. I mean, young people are very turned on by the climate issues, climate crisis. We've had our Friday school strikes here. There's been a lot of activism. In a way, it's the equivalent of what was happening in the 70s and 80s on nuclear disarmament, where the threat of nuclear war between the Soviet Union, as it then was, and the United States was very, very present threat, and people were very exercised by it. Now, what else do we have here? Anita Perkins asks, maintaining an independent foreign policy versus having greater levels of alignment, such as AUKUS, is often framed as a trade-off between independence, flexibility on the one hand, and greater security on the other. Is this a huge oversimplification? Yes. What nuance are people missing in understanding the global picture and the decisions behind New Zealand's international positioning? Ken, would you like to have a chew at that one?
Well, I just one comment. With great respect, the independence, promoting an independent foreign policy is one thing, and then to insinuate that you only maximize or increase your national security by not doing so is, I think, incorrect in logic, because the logic of New Zealand's policy in the 1980s was explicitly articulated that reliance on nuclear deterrence theory, MAD, mutual assured destruction, was a net disadvantage to our national security as perceived through traditional lenses. So that still obtains. And I think if we really want to find one of the ultimate ironies of recent history, it would be that New Zealand rejecting nuclear deterrence theory on the grounds that it was A, illogical and irrational, and B, a net disadvantage to our security, happened to coincide with continuing ambivalence, even within the USA, about nuclear deterrence. Because on the one hand, MAD was based on pure offensive strategic weapons and no defensive weapons. And that was agreed with the USSR and on a bipolar basis. Next moment, they are promoting various strategic defense systems, whether it was through satellites in the 60s or SDI in the 80s, or now Golden Dome in the 2020s, which undermines the very theory that the US and NATO relied on to justify its retention of nuclear weapons.
Now, Marion Hobbs asks the question, do we currently have a Minister for Disarmament? I've done a quick search. I can't see one since Nanaya Mahuta and Phil Twyford. Does anyone know whether has this position been dropped?
Yep, definitely dropped. under the nets, although Todd McClay is chairing the current Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament.
Yes, I saw that was reappointed, and
But not.
yeah, and Kevin Clements, who's a veteran on it, is still on it, I see.
Yep.
But that's a bit unfortunate that there's no ministerial focus as such. So yes, going back to Michael Webb, who asked, could we comment on the negotiations post the convictions, presumably the French spies, regarding their removal from New Zealand, the compensation, the trade implications, the role of the UN, and what lessons can be drawn from that aftermath? Interesting, isn't it, that the UN acted as the mediator? We see the UN rather weak today. Kate or Ken, like to have a comment on that? If something like this happened today, would we look to the UN for a mediator?
Well, I'd like to see us hearing about the UN a lot more in terms of what's happening at the moment, but certainly negotiating it, I think, was wonderful that they were seen as a mediator for that, and that there was a little bit of compensation for Greenpeace and for setting up the Peace and Disarmament Education Trust. But certainly it's a bit emasculated at the moment in terms of what's happening with the major crises at the moment. Ken?
Ken?
Well, yeah, obviously the UN is close to being in tatters, certainly in the sense that the original idea of rules-based order through the Charter never really worked properly. You go from collective security, which never kicked in through the Security Council, to self-defense under alliance treaties, and then a subjective interpretation of international law pertaining to self-defense, which is meant to be only preemptive attack if there is an imminent threat, and so on and so on. So it's pretty much gone back. That said, there have been and continue to be areas where there's positivity, and to be once fair to France, France and Mexico about a decade ago did develop some fairly serious proposals for reform of the Security Council. Small countries, like especially Liechtenstein, has done extraordinary work on various initiatives inside the United Nations. In fact, they've done the most recent reform one that worked, which is that only in the last 3 years or so, if there is a veto in the Security Council, and the whole of the Council agreed to this, if there's a P5 veto, the Council automatically votes to turn the matter over to the General Assembly, where the vetoing country is obliged to explain to the whole of the General Assembly why it vetoed. It's not obliged in the Council, but it is now. So there are different aspects of promotion. And I'll just finish on this as well. Just let's remember that the protocols to the Rarotonga Treaty have been ratified by 4 of the P5, including France, not by the United States. So if anybody needs to give an apology at the moment out of the P5, it's the US to the Rarotonga state parties.
Indeed. I see a comment from my lovely colleague Marion Hobbs, who said, Helen, you gave me 3 portfolios that were blissfully contiguous: environment, disarmament, and New Zealand aid. It was really powerful when speaking in international forums. Great combination, actually. But just above that, there's Alison Payne's comment. How much does public opinion count for these days? As a present-day example, we see so much protestations against the genocide in Gaza, but it seems to count for little. Recently on the BBC programme Moral Maze, a learned guy said public opinion counts for very little these days. Russell, you're in the business of mobilising public opinion. You began your comments last night on the Rainbow Warrior saying we have agency as citizens. We have agency as a small country. Can we mobilise it again?
Yeah. So think of, obviously the United States and what's going on there is a key global problem, right? But it's also that the No Kings days of demonstration were the single biggest protest in American history. So yes, it's true we've got this lunatic president of the United States, and this far right movement that sits behind him. But it's also true that everyday Americans are mobilizing in record numbers to try to reclaim their democracy. And that's how democracies are saved. It's doing what they're doing is how they're going to save their democracy. And imagine if a re-energized progressive American president and Congress were to come into power, what a tremendous positive difference that would make in the world compared with what we've got at the moment. So yeah, it's bleak, no question, but there is resistance and it is enormous. And you could see it change quite quickly if there was a change in the president and the Congress with a big movement sitting behind it, driving change. So, I don't think we should be despondent. Things can move and turn around quite quickly.
Can I pitch in there, Helen? I really
come in, Kevin, because you're also in the business of mobilising public opinion.
Exactly, couldn't agree more. I mean, remember what the days were like when we had, Muldoon letting the warships in, etc. It was, everybody thought it was very bleak, and we, what was the chance of change? And of course, that is just like, with Trump at the moment that Russell's just been talking about. New Zealanders got in there and did their thing, and it was because of that a Labour government coming in was able to do what it did. There was this huge grassroots movement, and it also, that same grassroots movement made sure that Bolger, when he tried to flip things over in 1990, couldn't. And that so it's always darkest before the dawn sort of thing. And I think that the public has massive agency, that we our opinions, public opinion is very, very important, and politicians know that. And so yes, it can be bleak. Things are happening which you don't want, but now's the time. That's the time to organise. It's always the time to organise, and that it sets things up for the change that we need. And for example, this government is just going to spend another $12 billion over the next 4 years on defence. At the same time, it's cut pay equity by $12 billion, saving $12 billion. We New Zealanders, it's impacting this sort of thinking, this non-independent thinking that's going on in this government has real impact on real people and their lives. And we need to be saying no. And a future government, the next government, should be reversing this stuff. And now's the time to do it.
Last words first from Kate and then from Ken.
Well, it's been great to have this out there. I think our young people need to listen to the elders, but also learn from some of the techniques we used and keep being positive about the effect that they can have by taking every small action, but it has to be funded at some level by government, not buying our voices, but allowing us to educate.
And Ken?
Just to complete the previous comment about the UN and so on, and in terms of the role of civil society, I totally agree with Kevin and Russell on that. And I think there are two levels of civil society. One is the Greenpeace and so on influencing New Zealand and other countries too. The other is members of parliament, and Helen will remember this very clearly, the Parliamentarians Global Action, which is a civil society. It's not a formal official organization, but it had huge influence on nuclear disarmament, sent a delegation to meet Gorbachev on that. And then through an initiative with A.N.R. Robinson of Trinidad and Tobago and Emma Bonino of Italy and so on, it had a huge influence on the Rome Statute, setting up the International Criminal Court and so on. So those two levels interacting positively can make a huge difference to change at the global level.
Well, fantastic comments, and just love the passion of everyone for New Zealand doing the right thing on these issues. As Kate said, there's quite a lot of mobilising opportunities for raising public attention to the nuclear issues. Coming up Wednesday fortnight, August the 6th, is the tragic 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And 3 days later, just to prove the point that they had a powerful weapon, another atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. I was in Hiroshima myself with the elders in May. We went, especially because it is the 80th anniversary year, and wanting to give support to the veterans and those who continue to advocate for a nuclear-free world there. And then, as you say, Kate, other anniversaries coming up around the International Court decision, et cetera. So let's not let nuclear weapons and nuclear war fade into the distance. It is one of the 3 existential threats that the elders highlight: nuclear weapons, climate crisis, and artificial intelligence as 3 existential threats to humanity that we need much better governance around. And of course, in the case of nuclear weapons, a move to abolition. So, in thanking everyone, I'll put it back to Murray to wind up us for today.
Thank you, Helen. That's it for today's webinar. Thank you very much to our panelists, Kate, Kevin, Kennedy, and Russell, for taking the time to join us today. If you're not a member of our foundation, please do consider becoming one at helenclark.foundation. We'd love to have your support. Thank you all very much for watching today's webinar, and for those of you who asked questions. And we hope to see you all back next Thursday at 12 p.m. for an insightful conversation with our foundation's brand new honorary fellows. Thank you very much.